Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Update, a weekly program devoted to the economic dimensions of our lives. Jobs, debts, incomes, our own, those looming down the road, those of our kids. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. Back to Greece. What is happening in Greece, as always, is important on this program because it is an advance notice of what is happening elsewhere in Europe, what will be happening in those parts of Europe where it hasn't happened before, and likewise for the United States. That's why we talk about Greece. So what has happened to Greece now? Well, once again, there are massive strikes and demonstrations across that little country. You might be astonished, as I was, to read that since the crash of 2008, there have been, count them, no less than 50 general strikes in Greece. The people have been active in that country, desperately trying to stop something. What? Wage cuts, service cuts, that is public services, cuts in their pension, selling off state property to both domestic and foreign corporations, and auctioning off the property of those whose debts were so big that they'd had to basically fold the tent and sell off everything that they own. The damage done to the well-being of the Greek household and family is staggering. It exceeds anything that has happened elsewhere in Europe to date. The latest strikes are about the latest action, and the latest action tells a big story. The latest action is a law, like all these laws, imposed on the Greeks by the Europeans as a condition for getting the loans without which Greece could not continue as a society. In other words, they've made the Greeks dependent on foreign loans, and the foreign loans will not be given unless the Greeks take the steps that the European community, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and so on, the IMF, impose on them. The latest one is to increase the number of people in a union that have to vote in favor of a strike before you can have a legal strike. Okay, it doesn't take genius to understand that every single step imposed on the Greeks since the crash of 2008 have increased the power and wealth of the rich at the expense of the mass of people, increased the power of capital, and diminished the power of labor. Every single one. What is going on here is a foretaste of what's to come. The Greek business community wasn't strong enough to get these things done. The mass of the Greek people, organized in communist, socialist parties, and in very powerful trade unions, simply made it impossible for the Greek capitalists to impose this kind of austerity on the Greek people. It had to be done by something more powerful than the Greek capitalist class. And so it was. The entire European capitalist class, organized into the IMF, the European Union, and the European Central Bank, together bailed Greece out of the crisis with loans, made Greece dependent on these loans because they did not have a crisis inside Greece, a fundamental change of the Greek economy to try to rebuild it on a better footing. No, they didn't do any of that. Instead, they solved the problem by borrowing from the Europeans who lent to them, knowing full well that by making them dependent on European loans, the Europeans could dictate the conditions for doling out bits and pieces of these loans. And the conditions were to reorganize the Greek economy, not to go beyond capitalism, but to go backwards to a harsher and more unequal capitalism, far beyond what the Greek capitalists could ever have imposed on the Greek people. So now the Greek capitalists can sit there saying, our hands are tied. It's those Europeans without whom we can't survive who are insisting that we do that. And who's doing it in Greece is just as important as what's being done. The who is the Syriza party. The Syriza party is a left-wing party. It prided itself on being more left-wing than the old Greek Socialist Party had been before it. And here's what that means, that the word socialist, the meaning of socialist, the meaning of left-wing, is being transformed in Greece. It's no longer a political movement that stands against capitalism. It's no longer a political movement that is a criticism of capitalism, is an advocacy of a fundamentally different system. The socialists have become the party that institutes what the capitalist wants, that makes it happen when the old parties can't do the job anymore because they've lost the support of the people. In comes someone who says, I can do a different and better job, cashing in on what socialism used to mean, getting into power, and then turning out, in the most cynical way you could imagine, to be more of the same old, maybe even worse. The reason this is important to understand is that it's a harbinger of what is scheduled for the rest of Europe and North America. As capitalism shifts its ascendancy to Asia, particularly to China, and that makes that the growing society, what it's leaving behind is the West. And as the West has to constrict itself, the question is, who gets constricted? The 10% at the top or everybody else? And you know the answer before I tell you. The name of the game of those at the top is to make sure that the adjustment to a declining Western capitalism is foisted off on the rest of the people. Greece is leading the way, and that's why it's important to pay attention.